My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I've finally finished reading The Fall of Gondolin, the latest and last book that Christopher Tolkien will publish from his father's unpublished materials. And in this particular case, uh, well, I'll just get to that in my explanation, but I'm basically reviewing the book so you can see whether you like it or not. So let's just get started. So the book itself very much follows in the vein of the previously published Beren and Luthien. And in Beren and Luthien, Christopher Tolkien in the foreword basically said this was presumptively his last book. Then we got news very happily of the publication of The Fall of Gondolin coming up, but in the foreword to The Fall of Gondolin he says, whereas in Beren and Luthien he said it was presumptively his last book, he says this one is definitively his last book. So what that means for the future of the Tolkien estate and any further publications. Maybe they'll find somebody to keep doing some of the work that Christopher was doing. Maybe this is the last thing we'll ever get in this type of vein. There are other Tolkien scholars out there publishing other works related to Tolkien's materials that were never really finished or published, so we'll probably still see more stuff in the future, but whether we'll see anything like what Christopher was doing, that remains to be seen. That said, the book itself, as I mentioned, is very much in the vein of Beren and Luthien. It doesn't do like the Children of Hurin did and just kind of take the latest material and form it into one cohesive narrative. It takes the various stages of the story, gives them in kind of order that they were written, and does kind of a compare and contrast to give you an idea of the progression of the story, the evolution of the ideas, and that sort of thing. So in that sense, if you liked Beren and Luthien, you'll probably like The Fall of Gondolin as well. And in this particular case, I think it works a little bit better because the Beren and Luthien story went into a lot, it underwent a lot of changes, whereas The Fall of Gondolin, there's not that many major versions because it is the last major story in the Silmarillion cycle, or well, last, second to last, depending on how you count it. And so Tolkien didn't get a whole lot of full treatments of it compared to the full treatments that he gave to Beren and Luthien. So there's a lot less progression, and most of the different versions come in the form of the shorter annals type readings that we get, very brief accounts as opposed to long, narratives. So that's one aspect of the book that I think works a little bit better than Beren and Luthien. The other thing about it is The Fall of Gondolin, especially in the later versions, really does have some of Tolkien's best writing. Reading through it, I was astounded once again at how very well Tolkien writes, particularly in the last versions, and just how beautiful his narrative and his just the writing style is. You get that in Beren and Luthien as well, but there's something about The Fall of Gondolin that it really just stands out to me. So, I mean, if you just want a really good example of Tolkien's writing and how it evolves over time without getting into a huge amount of the weeds like in Beren and Luthien, comparing and contrasting the evolution of the story, you get that here as well, but it's not as involved. And so you do get a better view of just a good, clear view of how his writing developed over time, as well as just some basic changes. So that's kind of my comments on the writing. The other nice thing about this is, again, like Beren and Luthien, they have Alan and Lee as the illustrator. And the illustrations are, I think, probably even better in this than in Beren and Luthien. I mean, they both have very good illustrations. Just as a disclaimer, Alan Lee is not my favorite Tolkien artist. I prefer John Howe. Mainly because Alan Lee's style is a lot more subdued and almost impressionistic, and I prefer the John Howe very clear lines, sharp, and John Howe does a lot more action scenes, and so I can see why they didn't use him, because The Fall of Gondolin is not about action. In fact, most of Tolkien's works are not about action. John Howe tends to focus on those scenes, but it's his style really that I like more than anything else. But I will say, Alan Lee has some very, very good illustrations in this particular book. And You've got several that are full page, and then at the beginning of the, well, that's not a very good example. Let me see if I can find a different one. Well, here's another here's another full page one that's very good. But also at the beginning of chapters in this book, he'll have like a very small pencil illustration. I'm trying to find a good example. The one I just saw was just kind of mountains and difficult to make out. There should be one early on that shows Tuor. There it is. Tuor with a harp. And that's one of the better ones that I could show on camera. Some of the other ones, if you don't see it in real life, it's probably going to be a little bit fuzzier. Because it's not, again, he just doesn't write very clear, sharp images. Did I say write? I meant draw. So the illustrations are very good. There are a couple of bones I have to pick with the illustrations. There is an illustration where it has Tuor meeting, there it is, Tuor meeting Ulmo at the shores of the sea, and it struck me that in this particular story, at this point, Tuor is supposed to be wearing a suit of armor and a sword that was left by Turgon, the king of Gondolin, at the instruction of Ulmo, and he was supposed to have already put that on by the time he meets Ulmo, and yet we can see in the illustration that Tuor looks like he just arrived from his travels and is still dressed in kind of raggedy clothes and is carrying a spear. I really wanted to see what Alan Lee would do with the, that suit of armor and whatnot, and see what it would look like, and yet we never get a view of it. We do get a view of Tuor in armor in some of the scenes that he illustrates with Gondolin, but it's not really clear if that's one that they made for him in Gondolin or the one that they left, at Turgon's original dwelling in Vinyamar. So I'm kind of disappointed by that, but overall the illustrations are very good. So definitely nothing to complain about there. The book is, just for reference, after you read all the extraneous material, 300 pages. Now some of that is including a list of names and things of that sort. They also do have a handy genealogy of the princes of the Noldor at the very end, which is nice, especially if you're not super familiar with the Silmarillion narrative, because there are a lot of names to keep up with. There is also a very nice Silmarillion fold-out map here at the end as well, which is very well drawn and very much in that that style that a lot of us love, the very clear black and red and whatnot. Beyond that, most of the book is just kind of giving the narrative, kind of giving some commentary, giving newer versions of the narrative, kind of exploring the changes, and that's basically what the book is. So I mean, it's not written in the style of a novel, and unfortunately, because it's exploring the evolution of the story, you don't get a completed narrative at the end, because the last version that Tolkien ever started, he never finished. So we get to the point where Tuor arrives at Gondolin, and then it ends abruptly. There's nothing after that in the last version, which is a shame, because it was easily the best version. It was a very well developed version. It was more detailed than some of the more brief versions of concise forms of the story that Tolkien wrote in between his original and toward the end of his life. And it was, again, just very well written, but unfortunately he just never got around to finishing it. So there's never really a complete narrative other than the original, which is not bad, but certainly not Tolkien's best work. And it's very different in style in his original version. So, if you want to get a good view of just how Tolkien's writing developed, both in terms of the conception of the story and in terms of his style, this is a very good book to get. And I would say arguably even better than Beren and Luthien for a beginner, because it's a lot simpler. The changes, there are some significant changes, but it's not quite the complicated evolution that the Beren and Luthien story goes through, because Beren and Luthien got more treatments than did the Fall of Gondolin, because it also got the Lay of Leithian, where he did an epic poem. This one, you've got the original version, you've got the Quinta Noldorinwa, you've got the a couple of shorter versions where he's just kind of trying to give an outline of the story, and then you've got his final version, which he never finished. There's not a whole lot of versions to explore. So that's basically my thoughts on the book. I would definitely, if you're looking just to pick up more books for your Tolkien library, this is definitely one to have. The illustrations alone are beautiful, and just if you don't have a copy of the Silmarillion and you're curious about whether you should pick it up, then reading the final version that Tolkien started for the Fall of Gondolin will definitely give you an idea of whether you're up to reading that sort of thing, because that is more or less the style. Now, a disclaimer to go along with that, the Fall of Gondolin is one of the major story arcs, and there's a lot of material in the Silmarillion that is more connective in nature. There's brief little periods kind of explaining what's going on in terms of history. Not all the Silmarillion reads like a cohesive narrative in the way that the Fall of Gondolin does, but it does give you an idea of Tolkien's style at least. So if you're looking for something like that and you don't already have Beren and Luthien, then this would be an interesting place to start, I think. And like I said, I think even the illustrations here are better than in Beren and Luthien. But that's kind of a matter of taste, so that's up to everybody else to decide for themselves. But definitely worth picking up. I think it was, even though nothing in here is really new, I think even compared to Beren and Luthien, which also had no new material, I think I enjoyed this one more. So certainly if you enjoyed Beren and Luthien, pick this one up. If you've been curious about picking up, any of these types of books that Christopher Tolkien has edited, then this, I think, is maybe the best place to start. So those are my thoughts on the Fall of Gondolin. So I hope you found that video enjoyable and instructive. Hope it gave you an idea of whether you want to pick up this particular volume. If you want to learn more about Tolkien, the worlds he created, then you can subscribe to me by clicking the button below. If you want to check out a couple of my previous videos, you can find those here. And if you also want to follow me on Twitter, you can at JRRTLore. I really need to do better on Twitter. I'm not very good at it. I mostly just keep my videos up to date there. Every now and then I'll post something outside of that, but I'm not a huge social media person, so I mainly use it to promote the videos, but every now and then I'll put something there. At any rate, hope you did enjoy the video. If you did, please do give it a like, share it around, and as I said, you can subscribe below. So until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.